I was extremely frustrated that the agreement, which was a fair agreement, 3, 3, and 3, some benefit improvements, private industrial settlements have been about 2.9, public 3.1, right in the middle, perfectly fair. I was very frustrated that wasn't adopted after the union leadership recommended it to their members. But to go on strike on virtually no notice after promising 48 hours notice was unacceptable. I think it's irresponsible. It's not fair to Torontonians. And it makes it virtually impossible to try to resolve this directly with the union.
Mayor Miller, are we looking at a contract dispute, or are we looking at a fractious situation within the union, Local 113?
Well, there's lots of rumors about splits in the union, and I can't really comment on that. It just wouldn't be appropriate. But what I can say is the TTC management, our professional negotiators, bargained fairly. They upheld the public interest. They reached a fair settlement. The union said it was a fair settlement. They recommended it to their members. They've got a duty to make sure that they deliver. And it puts everybody in an impossible situation, these circumstances. You know, we've got to now make sure that the city's running properly, and that's why I called Premier McGuinty immediately and said, Premier, we need back to work legislation. This is impossible.
Tell me about that conversation and what was his response to you over the phone?
Well, the Premier is terrific. I explained the circumstances. I indicated the union had broken its agreement about the 48 hours notice. And the reason you have that 48 hours is you might be able to bargain away any problems. And also allows Torontonians to plan. You know, people last night were stranded, and that is absolutely unacceptable. And I also said to him that because the union executive couldn't deliver its members, it makes it virtually impossible, although the TTC will be back at the bargaining table today. The Ministry of Labour has requested, but it makes it virtually impossible to solve the problem through bargaining. We already reached an agreement. It couldn't be sold. And I said, in those circumstances, I'd ask you to act as quickly as possible. The Premier agreed, and he is acting as quickly as possible to bring in appropriate legislation.
And what happens if this legislation is passed? What happens to the deal that was put together and was agreed upon, in theory, a tentative agreement? What happens to that agreement?
Well, I haven't seen the draft legislation. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to see it until it's public. But what has happened in the past is that the province recommends the appointment of an arbitrator, and they put in place certain rules, and then you fight in front of the arbitrator. You know, the TTC gave in some areas on this agreement, and in front of the arbitrator, it'll be in a position where everything is on the table again.
Does it mean, in essence, that some of the things that the union fought for and agreed to in the tentative agreement might be gone?
That's certainly possible.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about the need for the TTC to become an essential service, which in essence, to many people, what stands out in that is that they don't have the right to strike. How do you feel about that, given what has happened in the past 12 to 15 hours?
There's a motion before council on Tuesday, and, you know, my emotional reaction last night, I was extremely frustrated. Of course, you want to say eliminate the right to strike. It's not as clear-cut as that, though, and I think we have to be careful. What would be good about it is that the TTC is the lifeblood of Toronto, and Torontonians wouldn't be put at risk. What's bad about it is that all of the essential service contracts get arbitrated, and historically, they cost much more. The arbitrators tend to be more generous than parties freely bargaining, and they also impose the language. And when the parties freely bargain, your language is usually more workable and more realistic. So it's not quite as clear-cut as that. So we'll see on Tuesday. I want to wait until we solve the problem before making my own mind up. And you know, as I told you off air, Anne, my uncle was in a union in England. He was a meter reader for the electric company. My mum was a teacher at the time. Their union really made big gains, the Federation of Women's Teachers Associations. And my other uncle, when he left the Navy, became a labor arbitrator. So I have seen this in my own life about how it's supposed to work, and it's not supposed to work like this. When the union executive reach an agreement that's fair, you know, they've got an obligation as well. You know, I'm just glad that the Premier is acting as quickly as possible, because it's my duty now to get Torontonians to work safely next week, and the Premier is going to help.
Where does this put union head Bob Kinnear?
Well, I think he's in a difficult position, but that's between him and his executive and his union members. You know, our negotiators sat down in goodwill, gave in some areas, worked out a very fair agreement, and you know, he's representing his members, and you assume when he and his executive sign it, that they're representing the will of their members. And if they're not, it puts the TTC in an impossible position. Who are we going to negotiate with if we can't negotiate with the executive?
What will the negotiating be like if indeed they do sit across from the table once again as early as 20 minutes from now? There's been a lot of water under the bridge throughout this whole process, and it really came to a head last night with this snap strike that took Toronto by surprise.
And broke the word of the union.
Now, was that a legal document
No.
that said we will give you 48 hours notice?
No, if it was a legal document, of course, we would have had legal remedies. It wasn't, but it was the word. And in these negotiations, you have to trust people's word when they give it. The mediator appointed by the province was actually involved, I believe, in the last TTC settlement. He's certainly one of the best labor mediators. He's terrific. He was helpful this time in bringing the parties to an agreement. But I don't know where they can go. The TTC will be there in goodwill, but they've already offered a fair agreement that the union says was fair. So we're not going to negotiate against ourselves. So I mean, I think most people can guess what it'll be like at the table. It's going to be pretty tense.
TTC Chair Adam Giambrone said to me live this morning on CP24, we don't have any more money to bring to this. And he said, I am not optimistic that anything can come from this bargaining.
Well, it's hard to imagine where people will go, but the TTC management will be there in good faith. That's their duty. We only can assume the union will be there in good faith, but, they haven't delivered.
What do you say to the people of Toronto, and they're all watching right now? What do you say?
The first thing I say is thank you. People were amazing last night. They gave no notice about this strike, and people obviously upset and frustrated, as I was, but they got home safely. There were no incidents. It speaks to Torontonians again and again and again. We've got great people in this city. Second thing I say is we're doing everything we can to solve this problem. The Premier has agreed to our request for back-to-work legislation. It's a serious thing to do, but in the circumstances, there's no choice. And we're going to get the TTC running as quickly as humanly possible, but we need your help. We need people to help out, carpool. If you can bike, walk. And on Monday, if it's still on strike, certain roads will be no stopping, and we will need people to work flex hours. To come in late or early, to work from home. There'll be a bike lane on Bay Street, for example. There'll be a bikeway across the city. Use all the alternatives, and please help out your neighbors. People were great last night. If they keep up with that spirit, we'll get through this.
Are you shocked at this turn of events, Mayor Miller?
Extremely disappointed. The conduct of the Amalgamated Transit Union Local 113 is not acceptable. I don't believe it's responsible, and I know Torontonians share my view.
Are you optimistic that back-to-work legislation will be passed and will be implemented so that we might see the TTC back on track by Monday morning?
I'm optimistic that back-to-work legislation will be passed quickly. As to the exact timing, that's in the legislature's hands, and it requires, as I understand it, all-party agreement. So we'll have to see what the Premier announces and when he announces it.
What do you say to Bob Kinnear right now?
Well, I'm not going to speak to Bob over TV. I spoke to him directly last night, and I expressed my views, and I view this very seriously. We take people at their word. There was a commitment about 48 hours notice to close the TTC down in an hour is just unacceptable. I don't believe that's responsible. We expect better.
Mayor Miller, thank you very much. I know you have a busy schedule. It was to be your family day today. I thank you very much for talking to all of us and everyone watching CP24. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Sam. Thank you.
And you're watching CP24. Coming up, our live extensive coverage of the TTC